Pravina, working for BizTalk 360 technical support for 3 years. Hope you have interacted with me through the support emails. I'm eager to put faces to emails by interacting with you all for the next 3 days. I take the privilege of introducing our new speaker, Mike Bizub. He has been with Microsoft for about 10 years, holding key positions, managing integration services design, integration as PaaS for the enterprise. He has been helping the team with the platform design and migration to Azure Logic Apps and Microsoft Azure BizTalk services. It would be interesting to know how these integrations happen and their benefits. Let me welcome Mike and Vignesh to present the session. Over to you, Mike and Vignesh. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? So I'm Mike from IT Group, or as we've been rebranded, CS-E&O, which is Core Services, Engineering, and Operations. Today what I want to do is kind of go through how we do on integration. And there's a lot of, actually, Microsoft IT is huge, so there's more than just us that do integrations. So what I'd like to do is kind of recap some of the ways that it's been presented here in the past. We've had other people from the same team go through this, go through some of the new stuff that we're working on, and also some of the things that we're kind of working through right now to put into place. When it comes to integrations, this is what we deal with. This is what the integration business that our team supports at Microsoft looks like. Many different businesses, large volumes. Today, we're moving from our BizTalk servers into PaaS. And what I'd like to do is kind of start with the team. So there's two of us presenting. She's in the back. He's here for support. But today, the team is a cross-geo team that pulls this all together. So when we go through these slides, this is what's making it work right here. All right, so recap. So when we started moving to PaaS, and specifically to Logic Apps, what we wanted to do was sort of break this out into a conceptual model first. And what we decided to do was as we looked at the different types of standards we had to address, both for the protocol level and at a document level, we wanted to be able to sort of create something that was reusable, because as you saw, we have a large number of trading partners and lines of businesses and message we deal with. But something we could actually leverage across many different trading partners, many different businesses, and different types of protocols and standards. So one of the things that we did was we sort of segmented what a message would look like as it comes into us and out from us. One of the things that we had in place already was a gateway process. So we had the capability of being able to segment the traffic pretty easily at the gateway, so that as traffic came in, we could determine if it was something we wanted to go to our on-premise our BizTalk servers, or if we wanted to move it to our PaaS offering. And then as we go through the process, we also look inside the message sum to figure out the type of protocol and some of the things that we could do with it. And that helps us, as we'll get into this, sort of the patterns that we were able to develop, and also the reuse we were able to get out of some of the Logic Apps that we created. All right, so we had the conceptual view and how we wanted to move to PaaS. The next thing was the world that we were dealing with, right? Which was we had on-premise BizTalk servers that were predominantly doing our integrations for B2B. And we were moving to PaaS, so we did have some initial things that we did to be able to bridge that gap. We left BizTalk on-premise. For now, there were several reasons for that. One is, we had some technology that we had to still interface with, whether it was something like NetTCP or MSMQ. And then what we did was we put the gateway process in front of all of this. And this is kind of like how we separate our traffic today in our regions, right? And so Vignesh will go over the business continuity and the DR story. But for now, this is kind of like the way it lays out. And so what this all sort of turned into was a series of logic apps that we created, and each one of these blocks represent a logic app and for a message flow. And what we tried to do was create sort of like a signature that we wanted to have for each one of these steps, so that when you look at something like Edifact or X12, when the way the actions take care of processing this, they'll emit like 4 arrays for you: a good message, a bad message, generated acts, and received acts. And what we did is we took that approach and we created these larger grained macroservices or logic apps that could then be sort of slipped in to process during the rest of the flow. And what we did was we used basically something along the lines of a routing slip. And we'll touch about that when we get into the A to A piece of this. But what we did was we tried to do this so that when we looked at our messages and we looked at the types of messages we did, we had a large number of AS2 messages that were X12, and we also had a number of messages that were AS2 and Edifact. And what we wanted to do was have the flow work the same, but do a minimum amount of work to actually support the Edifact piece. And so what we did was we just created a separate logic app for Edifact. When a message comes in, after we crack it open in the AS2 process, then there's a logic app that takes the message, it looks at it, determines, am I Edifact, am I X12, it sets up the right URL for the right logic app to process, and then it sets some things that we call like a trading partner context. But what this does is it allows us to actually use metadata within the flow of the message to use the same logic apps to process many different types of trading partners and lines of businesses, so that when you get to things like, what schema do I need, what map do I need, this is all metadata that is configured when I onboard the trading partner into this platform, but it's the same logic apps that are processing it, whether it's going in to our on-premise services or it's flowing out to the trading partner. So the other thing that we wanted to achieve was, in this process, we wanted to start small. So we didn't want to have to spin up a lot of integration accounts and trying to do something really fancy. So what we did was we sort of kept this simple. And so right now what we're doing is we're sort of growing this. We're still processing through the same integration account. And we're also now we also have some BizTalk framework customers that are still out there, so we have to deal with those. And what we did was we actually wrote a custom implementation that for the document protocol. And when I'm talking about document protocol, it's basically the part that takes what the body of the message is that came in through an AS2 wrapper. And what we did was we basically wrote a process that takes that and treats it as if it was X12 or Edifact. So then the remainder of the flow is the same. So once we take this BTF, this document, and we convert it into XML, then it just gets translated just like everything else does. It's XML through the transformation process. And so this is how we're able to how we wanted to be able to actually get some momentum behind the migrations by leveraging as much as we could what we were putting in place. Okay, and so there's some various pieces under this that we use. We can talk about this offline if you have any questions about it, but at a high level, this is the way our B2B flows work. And it was our first cut, basically, at creating these. Now, some of this is, they're not static in that they're strung together, but in that way, but they have some dependencies on each other because they kind of know what's coming next. And as we went through the process of looking at some of the other non-traditional B2B flows that we did on BizTalk, what we realized was that there was a lot of pieces that were similar that we could reuse, that we wanted to reuse. So what we did is we went through and sort of made an effort to take the pieces as we needed them and refactor them into a different model. And what we tried to come up with was this composable architecture. And it's loosely built off of the concept of a routing slip, so that At what we did was sort of broke it down so you have basically a series of sources and destinations. All right, and so as we go through this, now what we get into, what we did is we went and built logic apps that represent these adapters. And the idea is that at the edge, I would have logic apps that may be specific to a specific source. So like, for example, an HTTP endpoint could be reused and leveraged across many different sources because I can actually have things flow in that allow me to control how that message flows. But something like a file trigger or file or SFTP, we couldn't do. So what we did is we built ARM templates that we deploy that by parameters we build specific to the actual endpoint. And today we have some that we're using with the data gateway, but this is one of the things that and one of the reasons we want to move to ICE is to be able to leverage this type of connectivity for our on-premise servers and files without having to go through an additional data gateway. All right, so the next piece of this is how we started implementing the routing slip. And so what we do is we actually looked at our business and the different types of integrations we had, and we started coming up with these patterns. And the patterns would be basically something as simple as pass-through, or it could be something as complex as like maybe having to do a flat file decode, some type of property promotion for tracking. And then, I might promote this or publish this into some type of pub subsystem. We have our own thing that we do, but I just added this for completeness out here on the right, with the idea that as I'm going through this process and we build these patterns, then we expose an API endpoint that is specific to a pattern, and within that we tie a policy, and that policy will build essentially the routing slip or the list of logic apps to call. So even though I've got them laid out in this order, they're not actually knowing what they're calling next. They're actually using what was built and passed in through the API and policy as part of the payload, so that basically the logic app knows that, and this is the part of the refactoring process, which was to know that it knows that it has an entry point and it knows it has an exit point. The exit point is always going to be an HTTP post until we get to the adapter router, and I'll talk about it in a second. And so what this does is it allows us to actually have this list that is configurable through the API and that can actually be executed, and we can actually now take our logic apps and we can actually basically create these reusable patterns, and you're not having to put dependencies on each one. They're basically independent of each other. The router process that we wrote is actually something that allows us, very similar, to separate the pattern and the message from the actual endpoint that's going through. So you could actually have you could have multiple subscribers for the same message that are going through actually the same pattern, but one may be sending it to SFTP and one may be going out through HTTP. So that was the part of this. And so the key takeaway here is, though, that we're now able to, and when we step back and we look at how we have our B2B flows, we're going to refactor those using this concept. Because it allows us to actually now quickly build flows that can accommodate the business without having to do a lot of rewriting. And then this takes care of the flows in both directions, in and out. But one of the things I want to get to, so I'm going to start going through some of this real quick, is the hot path telemetry. We actually put, and I think Kevin touched on this earlier, a type of try-catch around all of our logic apps. And there's some nuances to it that you have to watch out for, but basically within each logic app, we'll trap every exception that happens within the process, and we push that out through another service or through another logic app that then feeds into an event hub, and we have Azure functions that consume that. And one of it goes into our internal ticketing system, one of it goes into App Insights, and then what we do is we actually generate those tickets to actually send them to the right lines of business, and that's how we do our ticket management, right? And so we still use OnePath the out-of-the-box way, right? So we still do event hubs, we still do OMS, we generate business events off OMS, just like missing MDNs or missing 997, stuff like that. And then we'll feed those. Actually, when we generate those, we actually feed them back into the hot path, same flow. So it just generates the tickets for us. Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about really was the structure of our group and ALM and DevOps. When you look at our group today, the way it's split between Redmond and Hyderabad, and it's across many different, we have different teams that do integration for different businesses, and then we have a core team that manages the platform. But we work off of a common backlog for the platform. Okay, so the idea is that we start a sprint, and we use basically a documented, Git pattern of using branches of dev, release, and master, which equate to dev deploys into our CI environment, release goes into our pre-prod environment, and then master goes into our prod environment. The idea is that as we go through this process within the sprint, everybody in the sprint on the sprint teams live inside the develop world, right? So as they do things, they check it in. We go through a series of unit tests and functional tests using DevOps and pipelines and such. It's once we get to this, when we start doing pull requests, we basically are going to start taking our DRIs and start doing the remaining part of the deployment and any type of bug triage. And the reason for that is that we run the sprints usually in 2-week cycles, and what we want to do is be able to continue to have the sprint teams to churn on the backlog and work, but use the release branch to be kind of like that join process that brings a bunch of loose threads together into a central thread and put some gating around this so that we can always guard against the fact that we won't hit release our master with a new build until we actually have the previous one deployed. And then this, there's a lot of text here, but this is kind of high level what I just talked about. Some of the key points I want to hit on this, though, is for a large enterprise, and I think maybe it was alluded to earlier about being overly paranoid. So when we look at things like security and compliance and governance, it's very important for us. And one of the things that we use DevOps and policies Git for is to basically enforce the fact that you have to have, like, for example, at least 2 reviewers on a check-in, right? So for this pull request, I have to have at least 2 engineers that are going to review this code. I may also have policies that are going through the code and saying, are there any kind of security risk in here? Does somebody try to check credentials in or something like that accidentally, obviously? Or actually, if you're talking about SOX or some type of compliance, it's like, is the person checking the code in even supposed to be checking the code in, right? Are they part of the group that's defined as the group that can actually check this in? So we make heavy use of these types of policies and the product to be able to help automate a lot of these checks and to help drive a lot of our security and compliance checks that we have to follow. And then I walk through the way we do our builds. The thing about logic apps and like with the new way of doing things, the serverless world, there's some things that just don't work with, they just don't have unit tests for them, right? You can't unit test a logic app really. You can't unit test policies with an APIM. So what we do is we try to unit test what we can unit test, and then we have functional tests for everything else. And those functional tests actually we try to get the deployment as fast as possible. So when you start talking about having, a couple, maybe 100 150 logic apps over the course of time. Then you want to make sure that you make heavy use of ARM templates. Understand how ARM works, understand how linked ARM templates work and dependencies, and let it do all the heavy lifting for you. Let it parallelize a lot of the stuff that you get into, because it's very easy to just go off and start doing stuff in PowerShell. And then what you find out maybe is that you did stuff in PowerShell that ends up being sequential that could have actually been parallelized. And it really helps compress that time to get things actually out into your CI environment, so you can actually do your functional tests. And then I talked some about the unit tests. I kind of threw this in at the end, but the one point I wanted to just kind of make too on this slide is that Agile is not equal to no process. Okay, so you can be agile and still have process, and in fact, in some organizations, you have to have process, especially when you're talking about a geographically, diverse team that's across, a day and a half or a day time frame, and you're also talking about a bunch of different teams. Like earlier, I showed those teams that we have, and actually, those teams not only participate in their own business integration, but they participate in the platform and so in the development. So that's why we want to make sure that we have some type of process in place that kind of keeps control over this, so that when we go to do release our master into prod, right, it's in a good known state. And then also the other piece is that DevOps is not equal to no governance, right? So just because you're doing DevOps, it just means that you've got to do some things a little bit differently, right? And so, I'll start at the bottom bullet first. So when you're in a hybrid environment, you have to start looking at things like, who can see what. And when everything was in BizTalk and on-premise and behind things, it made it a lot simpler. When you start moving things out into you have blob stores, Cosmos DB, and all this other stuff. It's like, well, who can actually access the data? This becomes very important questions that you have to answer. And then cost optimization. Once you figure out paths and you start doing it, then it's like, well, then people start asking you, why are you spending all this money? Right? Well, because we moved to paths, but you have to look at it, right? Two key pieces that we're looking at. And this is something that comes also from security, from both internal but also external, is migration to ICE. So for IP whitelisting, that's one thing, but we also can be able to put our sandbox into ICE and also connect to our on-premise resources securely. And then also managed identities. Today we are today with the SaaS token and the tokens, you can have. You have to really be careful how you create your metadata, where you store it, how it gets deployed. Not only because you can proliferate this thing out into places you may not realize, but also because they're secrets and you can't just have them anywhere in any clear text. So what we do is, with managed identities, our hope is that now we can actually manage that outside of the logic app infrastructure altogether, and as far as having to have the SaaS tokens, but now then in our metadata, even at a trading partner document level, we'll be able to actually, if there's a custom workflow that has to happen, when we get into our business process orchestration flow, then we can actually make those overrides in the metadata without risking having any type of security or SaaS token within that too. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Vignesh, and you're just going to go over the rest of the story here.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Good. So here's migration story. So we at Microsoft CSEO, we have a platform which Mike has explained now. So to have a quick recap of this particular architecture, we are metadata-driven architecture. So how many BizTalkers over here? BizTalk, how many of you heard of BizTalk here? Good, thanks. Thanks for BizTalk 360, by the way. Yeah, so from BizTalk to the PaaS, we have a lot of microservices being in place in a PaaS architecture. So how we migrate to this PaaS architecture and how we accelerated this PaaS migration with our accelerator tools is what we're going to discuss for the next 5 minutes. So to tell about predominantly of this architecture, we have an integration account and we have a 20 set of logic apps which can handle both B2B and A2S scenarios. So, and then it has been customized with the function app. Wherever you need a customization, obviously for a B2B or an A2S scenario, you need a customization. That has been possible with function apps here. And how we drive this, the fueling of this particular architecture is through a metadata. So a metadata speaks, in a BizTalk language, I could say a metadata is nothing but the binding configuration, which knows what is the message and what schema I need to apply on it and what map I need to apply on it, and then what kind of a transformation or a customization I need to apply on that message and what endpoint it has to travel to. Either it should be a downstream or an upstream partner. It can decide on its own way. That is our metadata driven architecture. To suffice this architecture, when we started our BizTalk migration, I could say around 5 days per transaction. Say if it is a purchase or a transaction, I need to take 5 days to migrate it to PaaS architecture and then test it with my own solutions. So there will be different scenarios for the map which gets executed. For that, I need to test it with range of 1000 files, which would take me for 5 days. But we have come up with a solution for this migration. So we have a migration accelerators in place. So what is this migration accelerators? Last 2 conferences we have presented on TPM migration tool, which some people trading partner migration tools, which can help you in migrating your partners and artifacts like schema to the integration account. But here what we have done is not only your artifacts, but also the BizTalk flow can be migrated to AAS with a single click. So what is that? So this metadata creation accelerators helps in creating your JSON file, set of JSON files which will be uploaded to the Cosmos DB. So backend, the logic app invoke this Cosmos DB and then the list of configuration files, and then it will provision you the flow end to end. From the time you receive a message from the partner till it reaches to the downstream, everything is being decided by this metadata. So this is a metadata driven architecture, and this accelerator will help you with this. And if you see, this TPM migration tool will help you convert your BizTalk artifacts, whether it is a DLL format or a compressed format, whatever it is, it will help you to provision to AAS understandable integration account language. So all the artifacts in integration account will be provisioned through this logic app, and also the flow. If you are okay with our architecture and if you are use our architecture, we are happy to help you with our own accelerators, which is available open source now. I will give you the link shortly. So this metadata creation, to emphasize more on this, so we have a partner flow context, which is at the last point. This partner flow context is a combination of all the JSON files whichever is listed above. So it is a conglomerate of all the JSON functions. Yeah. So the milestones achieved. Without some milestone, we will not be able to measure our progress or a success. So yes, so this is a 90% effort reduction, wherein I initially told you we took 5 days for our migration to happen, but now it has been reduced to 3 hours per transaction for a partner. So that is a greater achievement with this migration accelerators. And how much we are live with? So we are live with 200 partners and 1200 transactions live in our AAS architecture now. So, and it handles 7 lakh transactions per month of volume every month. So that is the achievement with our accelerators here. So coming to our enterprise integration disaster recovery. So once your flow has been migrated to AAS, you will be having your OMS alerts, log analytics alerts to make sure your production messages were running fine. And when it comes to a disaster recovery, for an high availability system, a disaster recovery is a must. So we at Microsoft follow a active passive disaster recovery model, wherein we have a primary region, we have a secondary region, and we have a traffic manager to make sure the primary and secondary region is brought in place. So the primary region will have, so apart from these 2 regions, we will have another region wherein we will run a runtime sync and an artifact sync. Artifact sync is nothing but your schema, map, and all the artifacts whichever you use for your particular B2B scenarios. Sorry about that. Yeah. So once these runtime, these artifacts JSON is being synced. So we have a resource group lying in a primary region. We have a resource group running in a secondary region. So we need to sync these artifacts to make sure that whenever a disaster strikes, the secondary region moves up and running in the secondary. And when it comes to a runtime sync for any B2B scenarios, we would need an interchange control number sync as well, because that's the flag which will make sure you are non-duplicating your messages. So these non-duplicates will help you make sure your EDI process is going in a right way. So we are syncing this interchange control number of X12 EDI fact. And also when it comes to an AS2 for a B2B, we have a MIC algorithm. For a message you send out, you will receive an MDN. If there is a mismatch in the MDN, there will be a MIC algorithm error, which you will not be able to decode the message properly. So for that to sync, say for example, a message being sent out from a primary region and a disaster strikes, and a response comes in the secondary region, you will not be able to decode if there is no proper AS2 sync. So that is also being taken care with the 3 additional set of logic apps at our end, and it is available as an ARM template as an open source for you. You can also deploy for your environment, and that will be given shortly. And yeah, so we have a pre and post set of scripts which will run as an automation account for a runbook, which will make sure it is getting diverted to, all the traffic is getting diverted to the secondary region from the primary. So this script is also been shared with you shortly. So this script is also been enabled with syncing your Azure account storage. Say for example, if you are using a map and there will be a lookup storage, and if you are using typically a part-in or 846 and 867 messages, you will be having your own set of logic to put in your address details and gather the address details from the lookup table store. So to make sure that sync is being properly managed from primary to a secondary, we will also make sure that is being happening. So with these set of tools, we were able to migrate and also monitor our production in a very well-versed way, and we'll make sure that this particular architecture and our expertise with our experience with this architecture will help you as well, and we are opening this code source to the whole public. So please go have look at our demos and the videos which has been available. So due to the time crunch, which takes around 45 minutes for us to migrate from BizTalk to AAS migration, that demo will take. So we are not able to give this here, and myself and Ashish will be available offline to give you all your, to answer your queries and demos, whichever is available now. Okay, so with that being said, I'm moving to the next slide, and this is our appendix. So go to the GitHub page, Integrate 2019, which will help you to get our source code, and also the documentation around our accelerated tools. And please reach out to us for BTS migration tool at microsoft.com for any integration migration related queries. We will be happy to assist you. With that being said, I'm signing off. Thank you so much.
Covey.co